In this series of videos, we're going to have a look at the peripheral nervous system, which once again is a collection of neurons that exist outside of the central nervous system, which of course is the brain and the spinal cord. And what we want to do in this video is connect our knowledge of how neurons are regulated by neurotransmitters to the specific parts of the body that contain neurons that are regulated by each of the major neurotransmitters. The first of these parts of the peripheral nervous system that we'll discuss is what we call the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for controlling and regulating the voluntary motion that occurs within the body. This means that motor neurons that are used as part of the somatic nervous system are pretty much always going to be connected to some sort of skeletal muscle, because once again, skeletal muscles are the muscles that we use to exercise voluntary motion. Now, if we look at the neural pathway that occurs within the somatic nervous system, the general structure is relatively similar to that of a reflex arc, with the main exception being that somatic nervous system control is regulated by the brain itself rather than a reflex arc that will pass directly through an interneuron between the sensory and motor parts of this. Now, the reason why we say somatic nervous system control is relatively similar to that of a reflex arc is because the general pathway remains largely identical, beginning with a sensory organ, in this case the eyes, that recognizes sensory information, in this case the light reflecting off of this glass of water, that sends a signal into the eyes, and that information is transmitted to a sensory neuron, in this case the optic nerve, and the optic nerve then transmits that information to the spinal cord, and eventually that will end up in the brain. Because of this, because of the fact that the optic nerve is transmitting information to the brain, it is what we call an afferent nerve. And in biology, whenever we use the term afferent, it means that information or literal fluid is flowing to a specific object as opposed to away. Now, we're not going to talk in too much detail about the different functions of the brain, so if you'd like to know about the 4 different lobes of the cerebral cortex, that's research that you can do on your own time. Suffice to say that the center of the brain that regulates voluntary motion is what we call the primary motor cortex, which occurs in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex, which is the frontal part of the brain here that is largely responsible for regulating voluntary actions. And eventually, this information is going to be sent down to the effectors, in this case, the skeletal muscles that are responsible for carrying out this action. Now, the motor neuron that is connected to the skeletal muscles that carry out the brain response is what we call an efferent nerve or an efferent neuron. And again, efferent referring to the direction of information traveling away from the brain, as opposed to afferent nerves that transmit information to the brain. Now, if we take a look at the motor neurons that regulate skeletal muscles, specifically if we look at the axon, we can see that usually motor neurons in the somatic nervous system are heavily myelinated, and this exists for 2 primary reasons, both of which related to the role of myelin itself. The first function, most obviously, is insulation for the nerve, because especially if this muscle is one of the ones that we use on a daily basis, there's going to be action potential moving down this nerve multiple times every single day, possibly every single minute. And this means that it's very important to insulate the structure of the nerve to prevent any electrical damage that occurs because of large concentrations of ion flow in and out of the nerve. Now, the other reason why we want a heavily myelinated axon when it comes to muscular control is that myelin, as we looked at in our video on action potential, drastically speeds up the transmission by using indirect saltatory transmission from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier rather than continuous transmission, resulting in faster transmission of action potential, which therefore translates to faster reaction time and a faster response in terms of muscle movement. Now, whenever we involve voluntary movement, we are going to involve a specific neurotransmitter. Now, the two primary neurotransmitters in terms of regulating movement are acetylcholine and adrenaline. And in this case, acetylcholine, as was mentioned when we talked about it in the Synapse series, is the most commonly occurring neurotransmitter in the body because it is used as the neurotransmitter in somatic nervous system neurons, and therefore acetylcholine is responsible essentially for regulating all voluntary control that occurs within the human body. So obviously, tightly regulating cholinergic neurons is very important to making sure that muscles only contract and relax when the brain dictates them to do so. In the next part of this series, we're going to look at the autonomic nervous system, which, unlike the somatic nervous system, regulates basically all involuntary actions within the body.